The old Ford pickup rattled along the endless highway, its paint faded from decades of sun and rain. Behind the wheel sat Jonathan Miller, 68 years old, his hands worn and calloused from a lifetime of building homes for other people. Today, however, he wasn't thinking about roofs or wooden beams. He was thinking about Sarah. It had been nearly a year since he'd last seen his daughter. 12 long months filled with phone calls cut short, text messages that came less often, and excuses that piled up like autumn leaves. But none of that mattered now. She had finally invited him to visit her new home in Seattle, a home she had bought with her husband, David, after their big move to the West Coast. Jonathan imagined the moment, Sarah rushing out the front door, arms wide open, the same bright smile she'd had as a little girl when he came home from work. He pictured the two of them sitting on the porch, sipping coffee, talking until the sun went down. As the miles rolled by, so did his memories. He remembered building her a treehouse in their backyard in North Carolina, staying up all night to finish it before her 8th birthday. He remembered the way she used to ride on his shoulders at the county fair, laughing as if the world was perfect. Jonathan glanced at the passenger seat where a carefully wrapped gift sat, a framed photo of them from years ago, taken during one of their fishing trips. He had spent hours polishing the frame. "This is it," he muttered to himself as he spotted the green sign. Seattle, 25 miles. His heart beat faster. The long drive, the lonely nights, the aching back, none of it mattered. In just a little while, he'd be with his Sarah again. The road stretched out ahead like a promise. The sun was dipping low, casting long shadows across the quiet suburban street. Jonathan turned the corner and saw it, Sarah's new home. It was the kind of place he'd only ever built for other people. 2 stories of pristine white siding, a wraparound porch with hanging plants, and a freshly mowed lawn that looked like it belonged on a postcard. He pulled the truck into the driveway, the tires crunching softly on the gravel. For a moment, he just sat there, staring at the front door. His chest was tight with anticipation. He'd made it. All those hours behind the wheel, the gas station dinners, the nights in cheap motels, it was worth it. He climbed out, grabbing the framed photo from the passenger seat. As he walked up the porch steps, he could hear faint laughter from inside. His heart leapt. She's happy. She's home. And I'm finally here. The door opened. There she was, Sarah. Her hair was longer now, styled in soft waves, and she wore a crisp white blouse that made her look every bit the picture of success. But instead of rushing into his arms, she froze, her smile flickering for the briefest second before settling into something polite. Almost rehearsed. "Dad," she said, her voice warm enough to a stranger, but not to him. "You made it." Jonathan stepped forward, gift in hand, but she didn't move to hug him. Instead, she glanced over her shoulder, as if checking to see who might be watching. That tiny gesture sent a ripple of unease through him. From inside, David appeared, a glass of wine in his hand and a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Jonathan. Good to see you. Long drive, huh?" Jonathan nodded, forcing a grin. "Yeah, but I wouldn't miss this for the world." Sarah stepped aside to let him in, but as he crossed the threshold, she leaned closer and whispered, just for him to hear. "Dad, listen. About the neighbors, could you not mention that you're my father? Just say you're a family friend. It's easier that way." The words hit him like a punch to the gut. He blinked, unsure if he'd heard her right. "What? Sarah, why?" "Please," she cut in quickly, her eyes darting toward the living room. "It's complicated. I'll explain later. Just go with it, okay?" Jonathan felt the air thicken around him. He'd imagined tears, laughter, maybe even a long embrace. Instead, he was being asked to erase himself from her story. To pretend he was nothing more than a passing acquaintance. Inside, the house smelled faintly of lavender and fresh paint. The walls were decorated with framed photos of Sarah and David. Vacations, dinner parties, smiling with friends he'd never met. There wasn't a single picture of him. Not one. They made small talk in the kitchen, Sarah pouring him a cup of coffee while David chatted about the local golf club. Jonathan smiled and nodded, but his mind was elsewhere. Every glance from Sarah felt guarded, as though she was afraid he might say the wrong thing. When a neighbor stopped by to drop off a casserole, Sarah laughed lightly and introduced him without hesitation. "Oh, this is Jonathan, an old friend of the family." Jonathan's hand tightened around his coffee cup. He forced a smile, but inside, something cracked. That night, lying awake in the unfamiliar guest room, he stared at the ceiling. The words replayed in his head over and over. "Don't tell them you're my father." He had come across the country for his daughter. And somehow, in her new world, there was no place for him. The next morning, Jonathan awoke to the faint sound of clinking dishes downstairs. Sunlight spilled through the guest room blinds, but the warmth of it did nothing to ease the heavy weight in his chest. He sat on the edge of the bed for a long moment, staring at the neatly folded blanket at his feet, as if gathering the strength to face another day of pretending. When he finally made his way to the kitchen, Sarah was already there, hair perfectly styled, makeup done as though she were preparing for a magazine shoot rather than a quiet breakfast at home. David sat at the counter, scrolling through his phone, a smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth. "Morning, Jonathan," Sarah said cheerfully, as if nothing had happened the night before. "Did you sleep well?" "Like a rock," he lied, his voice steady. The truth was, he hadn't slept more than a couple of hours, his mind looping endlessly through the moment she'd asked him to hide who he was. He took a seat, accepting the cup of coffee she offered. The rich aroma filled his nose, but it did little to comfort him. Instead, he forced himself into the role she wanted, the friendly guest, the man with no ties. They chatted about Seattle weather, about the coffee shops downtown, about David's new promotion at some tech firm Jonathan couldn't quite pronounce. Sarah beamed when David talked about his work, her laughter light and polished. Jonathan smiled when expected, nodded at the right moments, even offered a joke or two. But each laugh felt hollow in his own ears. He was performing. Later that afternoon, Sarah took him on a tour of the neighborhood. The homes were immaculate, lawns trimmed with military precision, front porches adorned with seasonal wreaths. Every time they passed a neighbor, Sarah's voice shifted, brighter, more refined. She introduced him each time the same way. "This is Jonathan, a family friend visiting from back east." Each introduction was a knife, but he kept his smile in place. Inside, though, memories kept bubbling up, carrying her on his shoulders through county fairs, driving her to college on a rainy day, helping her move into her first apartment. Back then, he was Dad. Now he was just Jonathan, the nameless friend. That evening, they hosted a small dinner for a couple of David's colleagues. Jonathan helped set the table, arranging silverware the way Sarah liked when she was a little girl. Fork on the left, knife on the right, napkin folded neatly. But when the guests arrived, Sarah barely acknowledged his efforts. "This is Jonathan," she said with a polite smile. "He's been staying with us for a few days." Not my father. Not even a close family member. Just Jonathan. As the night wore on, Jonathan noticed the subtle ways they kept him on the sidelines. Conversations flowed around him but rarely included him. When he did speak, Sarah would quickly redirect the topic. It was as though they were afraid his presence might tarnish the glossy image they'd built. After the guests left, Jonathan stepped out onto the porch alone. The air was cool, carrying the faint scent of cedar from the nearby trees. He stood there for a long time, hands in his pockets, staring out at the streetlights. He thought about the long road he'd traveled to get here, not just the physical miles, but the decades of hard work, sacrifice, and love. And now, he was an outsider in his own daughter's life. He took a slow breath and let it out. For now, he would play along. He would be the polite guest, the quiet shadow in the corner. But deep down, a seed had been planted, a seed of something he didn't yet fully understand. Something that, in time, would grow. The following days passed in a blur of carefully curated moments. Sarah seemed determined to fill Jonathan's visit with just enough activity to keep him occupied, without ever letting him too close. On Wednesday afternoon, she invited him to join her for a walk through the local farmers' market. It was the kind of place Jonathan would have loved under different circumstances. Stalls bursting with fresh flowers, jars of golden honey glistening in the sun, the scent of roasted coffee drifting through the air. But Sarah moved through it like she was on stage. She waved to people with that same polished smile, spoke in a tone a little too crisp to be casual, and made sure to introduce Jonathan the same way every time. "This is Jonathan, a family friend visiting from North Carolina." The first few times, Jonathan forced his smile, even made polite conversation. But as the day wore on, the words started to sting like fresh salt on an open wound. He wasn't just being left out of her life, he was being erased. At one stall, an older woman selling baked goods leaned forward with a warm grin. "You've got your father's eyes," she said to Sarah without hesitation. Jonathan's heart gave a tiny leap. Someone saw it, someone recognized the connection. But before he could say a word, Sarah laughed lightly and shook her head. "Oh no, we're not related. Just good friends of the family." The woman looked between them, confused for a moment, before offering an awkward smile. Jonathan's hands tightened on the paper bag of muffins he'd just bought. He could feel the blood rising to his face, but he kept silent. That night, back at the house, a few neighbors stopped by for wine on the porch. Jonathan sat quietly, sipping his drink, listening as David told stories about his golfing trips and business dinners. When one of the men asked Jonathan what he did, Sarah jumped in before he could answer. "He's retired," she said quickly. "Used to do construction work or something like that, right, Jonathan?" Jonathan looked at her. There was a time when she would have said proudly, "My dad built houses with his own hands." Now, his life's work was reduced to a dismissive something like that. Later, while helping clear the dishes, Jonathan overheard Sarah talking to one of her friends near the sink. "It's not that I'm ashamed," she was saying softly. People here wouldn't understand. We've worked so hard to get where we are, and having him around just—" She stopped when she saw him enter the room, her words cut off mid-sentence. He acted as though he hadn't heard, giving her an easy smile and handing her a stack of plates. But inside, something shifted. The image he'd been holding onto, of the little girl who used to run barefoot through the grass into his arms, began to blur, replaced by this careful, guarded woman who saw him as a liability. That night, lying awake in the guest room again, Jonathan studied the cracks in the ceiling. He realized those cracks were like Sarah's new life, perfect on the surface, but flawed just beneath. And if you looked closely enough, you could see where the pieces no longer fit together. He didn't know why she had built this wall between them. But for the first time, he began to wonder what might happen if he stopped trying to climb over it, and instead started thinking about how to tear it down. The morning light seeped through the curtains, casting long, thin beams across the hardwood floor of the guest room. Jonathan lay awake, staring at the ceiling as if it held the answers to questions that had haunted him for months. Outside, the faint hum of traffic mingled with birdsong, but inside his mind, a different kind of noise stirred, memories long buried, now pushing their way to the surface. He thought back to Sarah's childhood, those early years when the world was simpler, and love hadn't yet become a complicated dance of expectations and disappointments. He remembered the countless Saturdays spent assembling her bicycle in the garage, the scraped knees he kissed better, the endless evenings reading fairy tales by the flickering light of a worn-out lamp. Jonathan's hands, rough and scarred from years of labor, had built more than houses. They had built a foundation for Sarah's life, brick by brick, with sacrifice and quiet determination. He recalled the nights working overtime to pay for her dance lessons, the cold mornings where he chose to skip breakfast just to buy her the latest school supplies. Yet none of these memories were displayed on the walls of the home he now found himself a stranger in. The pictures that lined the living room shelves were carefully curated moments of Sarah's adult life, elegant dinners, vacations with David, celebrations among friends. Not a single photo showed Jonathan smiling proudly beside his daughter. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a worn photograph from years ago, himself holding a chubby-cheeked Sarah, her tiny hands wrapped tightly around his finger, eyes full of trust and love. He traced the edges of the photo with a trembling finger, as if trying to grasp the warmth that had somehow slipped away. A soft knock on the door startled him. It was Sarah, holding a tray with breakfast, eggs, toast and coffee, arranged neatly with a small flower in a glass vase. Her eyes held a flicker of hesitation, an unspoken apology he couldn't quite name. "Dad," she said quietly, placing the tray down. I know things have been difficult. I didn't mean to hurt you. Her voice was softer than before, but still distant. Jonathan swallowed the lump in his throat. Sarah, I just want to understand. Why the distance? Why pretend I'm not your father? She looked away, biting her lip. It's complicated. I'm trying to protect the life we've built. The people around here, they judge, and I can't have them thinking I come from that. Jonathan's heart clenched. From where, Sarah? From the past we shared? From me. She nodded, tears gathering in her eyes. I'm sorry. He reached out, taking her hand gently. I sacrificed everything for you, Sarah. Every hard day, every lonely night. You were never a burden to me. For a moment, the distance between them seemed to shrink. But just as quickly, reality reasserted itself. The invisible wall she'd built, the secrets she kept, the life she wanted to protect at his expense. Jonathan let go of her hand and stood up. I need some air. Outside, the crisp morning breeze filled his lungs. He closed his eyes, the weight of years settling on his shoulders. He knew the road ahead would be long and uncertain. But beneath the pain, a spark of determination flickered to life. He wouldn't disappear quietly. Not when he still had the power to change everything. The evening air was thick with the scent of grilled meats and blooming jasmine as Sarah and Jonathan prepared to host a small dinner party. The guest list was carefully selected: David's colleagues from the tech firm, neighbors they wanted to impress, and a few close friends who had long since accepted the carefully crafted image of Sarah's new life. Jonathan adjusted his worn jacket in the reflection of the hallway mirror. He was painfully aware of the contrast between his weathered appearance and the sleek, modern style of the house. But he pushed down the rising tide of discomfort. Tonight, he would play his part perfectly. For Sarah. For the chance to keep a foothold in her world. The front door swung open, and guests began to filter in, laughter and polite chatter filling the space. Jonathan offered his hand to a few, introduced himself with practiced ease as a friend visiting from back east, and nodded politely at the compliments on the house. As dinner was served, conversation flowed around the table. David regaled the group with stories of his recent business trips and upcoming projects, his voice confident and assured. Sarah laughed brightly, her smile genuine but measured. Jonathan sat quietly, sipping his wine, carefully observing the scene. Then came the moment he had feared. One of David's colleagues, a man named Greg, leaned forward and asked, "So, Jonathan, what do you do for a living?" Before Jonathan could answer, Sarah interjected swiftly, "Oh, he's retired now. Used to work in construction, I think." Jonathan's lips pressed into a thin line. The word, think, stung like a slap. It was as if his decades of hard work, his skill and dedication, were now something vague and uncertain, an afterthought. Greg chuckled, not unkindly, but with a hint of condescension. "Construction, huh? Must be tough work." Jonathan forced a smile. "It's honest work," he said quietly. The laughter around the table grew louder, and Jonathan felt the heat rise in his cheeks. Sarah's eyes briefly met his, a flicker of apology hidden behind the practiced smile. Later, as the night wore on, Jonathan found himself on the porch, nursing a glass of whiskey and watching the stars. He could hear Sarah and David's voices drifting out from the living room, casual, carefree, worlds apart from the heaviness in his chest. A sudden voice interrupted his thoughts. It was Greg, stepping out for some fresh air. "You're a good sport, Jonathan," Greg said with a grin. "Not many folks could take a night like this without losing their cool." Jonathan chuckled dryly. "I've been through worse." Greg nodded. "I respect that. But I gotta say, your daughter's got quite the set of standards these days." Jonathan's eyes narrowed. "Standards?" Greg shrugged. "You know. Who she wants to be seen with, what kind of background she wants people to think she's from." The words hung in the air like a poison. Jonathan felt his hands clench into fists. Before he could respond, Greg stepped back inside, leaving Jonathan alone with the night and his swirling thoughts. That night, lying awake in the guest room, Jonathan replayed the evening over and over. The polite smiles that masked disdain. The subtle exclusions. The unspoken shame. He realized then that this visit wasn't just a temporary discomfort, it was a verdict. He was no longer the father she wanted to show to the world. And somewhere deep inside, a quiet flame ignited. A flame that promised change. The morning sun struggled to break through the thick gray clouds hanging low over Seattle, casting a dull light on the perfectly manicured lawns of the neighborhood. Jonathan sat at the small breakfast table, stirring his coffee absent-mindedly, his mind restless despite the calm around him. Sarah had left early for work, the usual crisp professionalism back in place as she kissed him lightly on the cheek, a gesture that felt more like a polite nod than affection. David was already gone, citing an early meeting. Left alone, Jonathan wandered to the living room, scanning the photographs that adorned the walls and shelves. Each image was a carefully curated chapter of Sarah's new life. Her smiling beside David on a sunny vacation, laughing with friends at a chic rooftop bar, and standing confidently in her sleek office. There wasn't a single picture with him. No reminders of the years they'd shared, the sacrifices he'd made. As he was about to turn away, a folder lying on the side table caught his eye. It wasn't there yesterday. Curious, he opened it slowly. Inside were documents, legal papers, financial statements, and letters from a law firm. One letter bore the letterhead of a prestigious Seattle law office. Jonathan's eyes scanned the words quickly. The letter concerned a trust fund established decades ago by Sarah's late grandfather, money Jonathan had never mentioned to Sarah. His heart quickened. The trust was substantial, designed to provide for Sarah's education and future, but it came with strings attached. Conditions on how the money could be accessed, by whom, and when. Jonathan had always kept the trust a secret, intending to reveal it to Sarah only when the time was right. But now, it seemed that someone else had accessed the documents. Suddenly, things started to make sense. Sarah's insistence on hiding their relationship, the anxiety about what the neighbors thought, the careful crafting of her image. Was it possible that she feared the truth about the trust? Or worse, that she suspected Jonathan might claim control over the money? The thought stung. He had spent years quietly working, sacrificing his own comfort so Sarah could have opportunities he never had. And now, that same generosity had become a source of tension and secrecy. Later that afternoon, while Sarah was out, Jonathan decided to dig deeper. He called an old friend, a lawyer who had helped him years ago with estate matters. Over the crackling phone line, Jonathan explained what he'd found. The lawyer's voice was grave. "Jonathan, this trust is significant. Whoever controls it controls Sarah's financial future. But it also means there are people who might not want you involved." Jonathan frowned, anger rising. Had Sarah been pushed to deny him for reasons beyond embarrassment? Was there a hidden force driving a wedge between them? That night, as rain tapped against the windows, Jonathan lay awake, his mind racing. He realized this was no longer just about hurt feelings or misunderstandings. It was about control, power, and secrets long buried. He made a silent vow. He would uncover the truth. Not just for himself, but for Sarah. Because sometimes, the deepest wounds were hidden beneath the brightest smiles. And sometimes, to heal, the truth had to be revealed, no matter the cost. The rain outside fell steadily, drumming softly against the windowpanes of the guest room where Jonathan sat alone in the dim light. The house was silent, save for the occasional creak of settling wood and the distant hum of traffic. Jonathan held in his hands an old leather-bound journal, yellowed pages filled with his neat, careful handwriting. He hadn't looked at it in years, but tonight it felt like the only thing grounding him in a world that was slipping away. He opened to a page dated nearly 3 decades earlier, the ink faded but the memories vivid. Sarah's first steps. He had written. She wobbled, then fell, but laughed it off. I promised to catch her whenever she fell. The pages told stories of scraped knees and midnight fevers, of birthdays celebrated with homemade cakes and gifts bought on shoestring budgets. Stories of a father who worked double shifts, who gave up his dreams so that Sarah could chase hers. Jonathan closed the journal and looked out at the night. How had things come to this? How had the daughter he had cradled in his arms become a stranger who feared the very mention of his name? He remembered the years he had spent saving every penny, putting himself last so she could attend college. The long hours he'd spent driving her to and from school, tutoring her when the subjects got tough, always proud of her determination. And yet, here he was, an outsider in her life. The injustice of it burned within him. But anger alone would not fix what had been broken. Jonathan's thoughts shifted to the trust fund, the secret legacy from Sarah's grandfather that he had kept hidden, hoping to protect her from the weight of money and influence. But now, that secret was out. And it had torn a wedge between them. He realized that if he wanted to mend the relationship, or even reclaim the respect he once had, he would need a plan. One that would make Sarah see him not as a burden or a liability, but as the father who had always been there. One that would make the world around her recognize his worth. Jonathan sat back in the chair, the journal resting on his lap. He didn't know exactly how or when, but he knew this was only the beginning. He would use every resource he had, every memory, every ounce of strength, to remind Sarah of who he truly was. Not just the man she tried to hide, but the man who loved her unconditionally. Days slipped into weeks, and Jonathan's presence in Sarah's life became a quiet storm, unsettling the fragile balance she'd so carefully constructed. The polite smiles and forced conversations grew colder, the silences thicker. Jonathan noticed the shift, not just in Sarah, but in David too. The way David's gaze lingered on him with thinly veiled suspicion, the way he intercepted phone calls or changed the subject when Jonathan was near. One evening, Sarah invited Jonathan to join them at a neighborhood gathering, a chance, she said, to meet more people and fit in. Jonathan agreed, hoping to bridge the widening gap. But as they entered the bustling living room filled with familiar faces and polite nods, Jonathan quickly realized this would not be a night of reconciliation. A few neighbors greeted Sarah warmly, but when Jonathan approached, their smiles faltered, eyes darting away or narrowing in judgment. Midway through the evening, David pulled Sarah aside. Jonathan caught fragments of their whispered conversation, words like embarrassment, damage, and boundaries floated through the air. Moments later, Sarah approached Jonathan with a strained smile. "Maybe it's better if you don't stay too long," she said softly. Jonathan's heart tightened. "Sarah, why are you pushing me away?" She looked down, her voice barely above a whisper. "Because it's easier. Because I'm scared." "Scared of what?" he asked, stepping closer. "Scared of losing everything I've worked for. Scared that if people knew the truth, they'd see me as less." Jonathan swallowed hard, the words cutting deeper than any insult. He realized then that her rejection wasn't just pride or shame, it was fear. Fear of a past she wished to bury, fear of a future uncertain. That night, back in the guest room, Jonathan stared at the ceiling, the weight of the moment pressing down on him. He could stay silent, accept the role of the invisible father, or he could fight. And fight he would. Because love, he knew, wasn't about hiding in shadows. It was about standing tall, even when the world tried to knock you down. The days that followed the neighborhood gathering were marked by an eerie silence. Jonathan noticed the subtle changes in Sarah's demeanor, a polite distance where there had once been warmth, a careful avoidance of eye contact, and a quiet urgency to keep him at arm's length. He found himself wandering the empty streets of the neighborhood alone more and more often, beneath the overcast Seattle skies that mirrored the heaviness in his heart. The world he had hoped to rejoin seemed to retreat further with every passing day. But beneath that growing isolation, a quiet resolve began to take root. Jonathan had spent his life building things, homes, memories, and a future for his daughter. Now, faced with rejection and silence, he understood that rebuilding would take a different kind of strength, one born not of hammer and nails, but of patience and subtlety. He started by quietly researching. Late into the night, he pored over documents, legal papers, and the letters he had found in Sarah's living room. The trust fund, the estate plans, the conditions attached to the money. Every detail was a thread he could pull. He reached out to old acquaintances, people he had helped over the years, many now in influential positions. With each phone call, each meeting over coffee, he quietly gathered support, not with anger, but with the steady dignity of a man who refused to be erased. Jonathan also took care to observe Sarah and David's routines, learning their schedules, their habits, the small cracks in their polished facade. He did not confront or accuse. Instead, he moved like a shadow, patient and deliberate. One afternoon, while walking through a local library, he overheard a conversation between two women discussing an upcoming charity gala, an event Sarah and David were heavily involved in. An idea began to form. If he could gain access to that event, he could remind Sarah, and everyone else, of the man he truly was. Not just an aging guest or a forgotten father, but a force to be reckoned with. But Jonathan knew the importance of timing. Any rash move would only push Sarah further away. That evening, back in Sarah's home, he kept his feelings tightly controlled. Over dinner, he smiled when she spoke about her work, nodded when David detailed his projects, and laughed at the appropriate moments. Yet beneath the surface, the storm was gathering. Jonathan had retreated into the shadows, but soon, he would step back into the light, on his own terms. Jonathan sat alone in the small cafe near Sarah's neighborhood, the steam rising gently from his untouched cup of black coffee. Outside, the city buzzed with life, pedestrians hustling past, cars honking softly, the distant murmur of street musicians filling the air. His mind was calm, but beneath that calm simmered a determination as fierce as any storm. He had made his decision. If Sarah wanted to erase him from her life, then he would rewrite the story, in a way no one expected. He pulled from his worn leather satchel a thick envelope addressed to a local charity foundation. Inside were documents, checks, and letters of support from people he had quietly reached out to over the past weeks. Jonathan had donated a significant portion of his savings anonymously to the foundation, funding a new community center and programs for disadvantaged youth, a project close to his heart. But this gift wasn't just generosity. It was a message. A reminder that Jonathan Miller was a man of honor and impact, even if his own family refused to see it. That evening, back at Sarah's home, the air was tense. Sarah glanced nervously at her phone, checking messages as if expecting bad news. David paced near the window, his jaw tight. Jonathan sat quietly, observing them both with a calm that masked his inner resolve. Days later, the charity announced the unexpected donation publicly, a substantial gift made by a mysterious benefactor who wished to remain anonymous. The news spread quickly through the community, featured in local papers and online forums. Sarah's carefully maintained social circle buzzed with curiosity and admiration for the unknown donor. What no one knew was that Jonathan had orchestrated every detail, not for praise, but for respect. Sarah's world, built on appearances and whispered secrets, was beginning to crack. One afternoon, Sarah confronted Jonathan in the kitchen. "Why are you doing this?" she asked, her voice trembling with a mix of anger and confusion. Jonathan looked her in the eye, steady and unflinching. "Because I'm still your father," he said softly. "And because some things are bigger than pride or fear." For the first time in weeks, Sarah's facade faltered. She looked away, tears gathering. Jonathan reached out, but she stepped back. "I don't know if I can forgive you," she whispered. He nodded, understanding the pain was mutual. But he also knew the first step had been taken. Sometimes, the greatest revenge wasn't in vengeance, but in reminding the world, and yourself, of your worth. Jonathan's quiet gift to strangers was just the beginning of a reckoning that would change everything. The crisp autumn air pressed against the windows of Sarah's home as Jonathan sat quietly in the living room, the soft ticking of the grandfather clock filling the silence between them. Tonight was different. The carefully maintained facade Sarah had built was starting to crack, revealing the fragile truth beneath. Earlier that day, Jonathan had received an unexpected phone call from an old family lawyer, someone who had known Sarah's grandfather well. The lawyer spoke in hushed tones, revealing information Jonathan had never been told. There was more to the trust fund than the surface documents suggested. The trust wasn't just a financial safety net, it contained clauses that could shift control over the estate if certain conditions were met. and it appeared that Sarah and David had unknowingly triggered one of those conditions by excluding Jonathan from her life. Jonathan's mind raced. Could this be the key to mending their fractured relationship? Or would it deepen the divide? He decided it was time to confront Sarah, not with anger, but with the truth. "Sarah," Jonathan began carefully as she entered the room, "there's something we need to talk about. About the trust. And what it means for all of us." Sarah's eyes widened, her carefully composed expression faltering. "What do you mean?" He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out the letter from the lawyer. "This letter says that if you exclude me completely, I have legal rights to challenge the current arrangements. I never wanted to use it. I hoped we could find a way without the law." Sarah sank into the couch, the weight of the revelation settling over her. "I didn't know. I thought I was protecting us, from embarrassment, from judgment." Jonathan nodded. "I understand why you're scared. But hiding the truth only makes it worse. We can't rebuild on lies." The room was heavy with silence, the air thick with unspoken pain and years of misunderstanding. Finally, Sarah whispered, "I don't know if I can trust you again." Jonathan's voice softened. "I don't expect you to. But I'm here, and I'm not going anywhere." Later that night, Sarah sat alone in her bedroom, the letter clutched in her hands. Memories flooded back, her father's sacrifices, his unwavering support during her darkest times, the love she had tried to bury beneath layers of fear. Tears streamed down her face as she realized how much she had lost in trying to protect her perfect life. Outside, Jonathan stared at the stars from the porch, hoping this revelation would be the beginning of healing, for both of them. Because sometimes, the hardest truths are the ones that set us free. The morning after their conversation hung heavy with unspoken emotions. Jonathan awoke early, the pale light filtering through the curtains casting soft shadows on the walls. For the first time in weeks, a faint glimmer of hope stirred within him. Downstairs, Sarah was already awake. Jonathan could hear the quiet clink of dishes and the low murmur of the news playing softly from the kitchen radio. He rose slowly, gathering himself before stepping into the day that might mark a new beginning. As he entered the kitchen, Sarah looked up, her eyes meeting his with a vulnerability he hadn't seen in a long time. "Coffee?" he offered with a tentative smile. She nodded, and for a few moments, they sat in silence, sharing the warmth of the steaming mugs. "I've been thinking," Sarah began, her voice soft but steady, "about everything. About us. I want to try. To understand. To rebuild." Jonathan felt a swell of emotion, but he kept his tone gentle. "It won't be easy. There's a lot of damage. But I'm willing to take it one step at a time." They spoke then, not just of the past but of hopes and fears, of regrets and dreams. Jonathan shared stories from his journal, tales of her childhood, moments of laughter and love she had nearly forgotten. Sarah listened, sometimes with tears, sometimes with a smile, but always with growing warmth. Days turned into weeks. The tension that had clouded their interactions began to lift, replaced by tentative moments of connection. They shared dinners, walked in the park, and even revisited places from Sarah's childhood. Jonathan watched as the walls Sarah had built around herself slowly crumbled, revealing the daughter he remembered and the woman she was becoming. David remained cautious but gradually softened, recognizing the genuine effort both were making. One afternoon, as the sun dipped low over the city, Sarah took Jonathan's hand. "Thank you," she whispered, "for not giving up." Jonathan squeezed her hand gently. "Never. Rebuilding bridges takes time, patience, and courage. But for Jonathan and Sarah, it was a journey worth every step. Because even after the deepest wounds, love has the power to heal. The evening air was heavy with anticipation as Jonathan stood at the edge of the garden, the soft glow of lanterns casting long shadows across the neatly trimmed hedges. Tonight's dinner was different, an intimate gathering of family and close friends, meant to mark a new chapter. But beneath the calm surface, a storm was brewing. Sarah approached, her face set with determination. "Jonathan," she began quietly, "there's something we need to clear up before tonight ends." He nodded, sensing the gravity in her voice. David appeared from the house, arms crossed, eyes sharp. The unspoken tension between the three of them was palpable. Sarah took a deep breath. "Dad, I've been honest about my fears, about how the past might hurt the future we've built. But I realize now that pushing you away only caused more pain. It's time we face everything together." Jonathan met her gaze. "I've waited a long time for this moment, Sarah. To be seen, not as a mistake or a secret, but as your father." David stepped forward, his voice firm but not unkind. "I was skeptical at first. I saw the distance between you two and worried it would never change. But I can see the effort, and I respect it." The three stood in the quiet garden, the weight of years pressing down, but also the fragile hope of reconciliation rising. Suddenly, Sarah reached into her purse and pulled out a small box. "This is for you, Dad," she said, her voice trembling. Jonathan opened it slowly to reveal a simple silver key, engraved with their family initials. "It's the key to my new apartment," she explained. "I want you to have your own space here, close to me. No more hiding. No more pretending." Tears welled in Jonathan's eyes as he embraced her. The barriers built over years of silence began to crumble, replaced by a tentative but genuine connection. That night, as the guests toasted to new beginnings, Jonathan felt a peace he hadn't known in years. The final confrontation had brought more than resolution. It had opened the door to a future where love and honesty could finally thrive. The morning sun poured through the windows of Sarah's apartment, filling the room with a warm, golden light. For the first time in what felt like forever, Jonathan woke without the weight of distance or rejection pressing on his chest. He stretched, feeling a quiet calm settle over him. The small space was simple but cozy, a place that symbolized the new chapter unfolding in their lives. A place where the past no longer cast long shadows, but where hope and possibility took root. Sarah was already awake, bustling in the kitchen. The smell of fresh coffee mingled with the scent of cinnamon from the homemade muffins she was preparing. Jonathan watched her for a moment, heart full. The woman before him was strong, determined, and healing, someone who had faced fear and pain but chosen love over silence. "Morning, Dad," Sarah said softly, turning with a smile. "Morning, Sarah," he replied, returning her smile. "I like it here." She nodded. "It's ours now. Our space. A fresh start." They sat together at the small kitchen table, sharing breakfast and stories of the day ahead. No pretense. No hidden truths. Just two people rebuilding what was once broken. In the weeks that followed, their bond deepened. Jonathan attended Sarah's work events, no longer a shadow but a proud father. Sarah, in turn, embraced her past and her family with newfound courage. David grew to respect the man Jonathan was, steadfast, kind, and unwavering in his love. The community that once whispered and judged now watched as the family transformed, inspiring others with their story of redemption and resilience. One afternoon, Jonathan found himself standing in front of the community center he had helped fund. Children's laughter spilled from the open doors, a testament to second chances and new beginnings. He smiled, thinking back to the long road traveled, the pain, the silence, the secrets. But most of all, the love that had endured. Because sometimes, the greatest journeys aren't measured in miles, but in forgiveness. And in the courage to start again. Thank you for spending this time with us. If the story moved you, even a little, let us know. Drop a like, share it with someone who needs to hear it. And subscribe for more stories that stay with you long after the screen fades. Your support means more than you know.